Hello everyone, welcome to this video. We're going to be talking about careers in technology. In particular, in this video, we're going to be talking about where to start. So in this video, we're going to provide an introduction to the different roles that you're going to find in the tech industry. And we're also going to provide a little bit of guidance about some of the programming languages and some of the tools that might be of interest to you if you're planning to start a career in technology. We're also going to be talking about some of the initial steps that you can take towards that goal. So in that sense, this video is mainly oriented towards people that are going to start a career in tech or are planning to start a career in tech. So maybe you're a computer science student or a student from a related field, or maybe you're working in a different industry at the moment or studying for a different industry at the moment and are planning to start a career in technology as well. So to start with, let's start with the following question. Have you ever wondered how a specific website, application, or video game that maybe you are interested in works behind the scenes? Have you ever maybe stopped and thought about how do they put that product out in the market? What does happen behind the scenes? And for this particular video, I'm going to be using Netflix as an example. And I want us to start separating the things that we see about Netflix versus what we don't see behind the scenes. Just as a disclaimer, I haven't worked for Netflix. However, many of us know what Netflix is or have either interacted with either Netflix or a service very similar to it. So if you think about Netflix in its very basic form, we're going to be provided as a user with a list of content. It could be a list of movies, and we can select using a user interface the movie that we want to see, or maybe a TV series, whatever it is. And as soon as we click the series or the movie that we want to watch, it's gonna, fetch it from us from somewhere, and we're gonna be able to start streaming or watching the movie online. And this is what I mean by separating what we see versus what we don't see. As users, we see, of course, the list of content, the list of movies that is being presented to us. And when we click the movie, it's gonna start, of course, playing the movie for us. But I want us to also start thinking about those things that we don't see behind the scenes. What happens behind the scenes that makes all of this possible? And excellent. Before we dive in, just two very quick disclaimers. The first one is that this is not intended to be an exhaustive list of all the possible roles in the tech industry. So if maybe you are seeing the list of roles that we're going to talk about and you don't see a particular role, it's because, again, this is not an exhaustive list. We're using this video to provide a sample or a subset of the different types of roles that you're going to find in the industry. And again, for this particular video, we're going to be using some common websites, in this particular case, Netflix, just for illustration purposes only. This is not a representation of exactly how they work internally. I haven't personally worked for Netflix, so all what I'm doing here is using Netflix as a quick example to start talking about different types of roles in the tech industry. Excellent, so let's get started. Now, nowadays in the market, when you start or use a product like a website or an application or a game, you're going to be presented with what is called a user interface, right? And that's what you're using to interact with that application. That application, or that part of the application, sorry, is what is called the front end of the application. And in general, you're going to find inside of companies 3 different types of roles that are in charge of developing that application. You're going to find front-end developers, you're also going to find user interface designers, and you're also going to find user experience designers. And we're going to talk about a little bit about the difference between those 2 roles in just a second. So the front-end developers are the ones in charge of actually coding that front-end, right? So they're the people that are actually writing the code to make sure that when you click on something or you press on one of the movies in Netflix, something happens behind the scenes and they load a new screen, for example, where you're actually going to start seeing the movie. And the technology is used by different types of front-end developers. It depends on the type of system that they're developing. Let me explain what I mean by that. So you have front-end developers that can be developing a website, which are called web developers. You can find front-end developers that are maybe in the gaming industry, and they are going to be game developers that they use slightly different technologies than web developers, for example. And in the case of Netflix, let's talk a little bit about that. You have a web frontend, but you also have, for example, a mobile app that you can use to basically load the same content. So chances are that you're gonna have mobile developers as well. So you have a variety of front-end developers depending on the type of application that you're building, and the technologies that they use tend to be slightly different. And we're going to cover some of those technologies in just a second. Now, let's talk a little bit about the user interface and the user experience designers. Now, the user interface designers are more concerned about, okay, how is the website or the application going to look? Making sure that the colors are consistent or that the style is consistent. Whereas the user experience designers are more concerned about the user journey throughout the application. And what do I mean by that? Maybe a user interface designer is making sure that the style is consistent and maybe the application looks great, but if the users don't know how to navigate that application, for example, if you just start Netflix and everything looks great, but you don't know how to load a movie, it might mean that the user journeys and the user experience is not great. And that's where the user experience designers come into play. They're making sure and talking with users to make sure that that experience is as smooth as possible. Now, let's talk a little bit about the different types of technologies that are common at the moment in the market. And what I'm going to show here is by no means, again, an exhaustive list, right? This is just to give you some guidance about what technologies you might want to start reading about or looking about if any of these roles is of interest to you. So let's start with web front-end developers or web developers. Now, if you're planning to go into web development or if that sparks interest to you, the following set of technologies are something that you might want to start looking into. So the first thing is that maybe the programming languages that you want to start learning is either JavaScript or TypeScript. You need to start looking into HTML and CSS. HTML and CSS are basically what the browsers are using and what the front-end developers are providing to the browser to make sure that the content is rendered properly. It might be also important, although not necessary depending on the company that you're working for, to start looking into design tools. And you might want to start looking, for example, into Adobe XD or Figma. And what are these tools used for? These tools are used a lot to communicate what the user interface and the user experience designers want the website to look like to the developers. So these are the tools that UI designers and UX designers generally are going to use to create those designs. And those designs are going to be then passed to the developers such that they know, okay, this is exactly what I need to code. And by no means, and again, this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are just examples of some of these tools. If you are interested in UI design or UX design, it might be also very beneficial to you to start looking and learning how to use these tools. Now, when you're building a website, and in general, this applies to all the different development roles that we're going to be talking about, the programming languages come with a set of frameworks and languages that you can use to enhance and make your life easier as a developer. So if you're developing a website, there are two common frameworks at the moment in the market that are very popular and might be of interest to you, which are called React and Angular. And they make the development of websites and single page applications, as they're called, a little bit easier. Now let's move into game developers. Now game developers use a slightly different set of tools than web developers because of course the experience that needs to be provided is slightly different. Game developers in general use what is called a game engine behind the scenes, and depending on the game engine that you're using, the choice of programming languages, the choice of programming language is going to be slightly different. So, for example, if you choose to use a game engine called Unity 3D, which is a very popular choice nowadays, you might need or want to start looking into C# as a programming language. Other game engines, for example, use C++ as the language, so you might want to start looking into that. However, again, this is not an exhaustive list. You can find game engines in other programming languages as well, for example, Lua and Java as well. You can find game engines, that are using those programming languages. If you want to move into the area of mobile applications, if you want to learn how to create and develop applications for mobile phones, then the choices are slightly different as well. If you're planning to write applications for Android, then you might want to start learning Java or Kotlin. And if you want to move into iOS or Apple devices in general, one of popular choice nowadays is a programming language called Swift. Now, there is a last area that is also becoming popular in the market, and that might be of interest to you, which are called hybrid applications. And what do we mean by hybrid applications? These are applications that the essence behind them is that you write them once, and they're going to work both, for example, in mobile phones and also in web browsers. So the idea behind them is that you only need to write the code once instead of maybe writing the code twice, one for your web application and one time for your mobile applications, right? And having two different versions of the code. The idea with hybrid frameworks is that you write the code only once. And popular choices nowadays in the market at the time of recording this video are the three that I'm showing the screen, which are React Native, Ionic, and Flutter. Again, not an exhaustive list, but things that you might want to start looking into. Excellent. Now let's move into the next or into another part of the system. So as a user, for example, if you're again coming back to the Netflix example, as a user, if you start clicking on different parts of the application and you start interacting with that user interface that was created or developed by the front-end developers, things need to start happening behind the scenes, right? So we're going to start moving into that space of a website or of an application that we don't see. So let's assume that you open Netflix, and of course it needs to load that list of movies and TV series and recommendations for you, and it needs to get that content from somewhere. And that somewhere, well, it tend to be application servers that the company owns behind the scenes. And this is what is called the backend of the application. And the backend of the application is generally, of course, the place where you store the data and where these companies are actually processing the data behind the scenes. And in terms of backend of the backend of a system, there are different types of roles that you're going to find. Again, these are some of the ones that you're going to find. It's not a complete list, but you're going to find backend developers. Depending on the company and the size of it, you're also going to find security engineers or security experts to make sure that the system is not hacked. And depending on the company again, you might find database and server administrators. This depends a lot on the company. For example, if the company is using cloud-based providers or cloud systems, these roles might not be there in that company. It really depends on the company that you join. In any case, let's talk a little bit about backend developers, for example. So backend developers, they're in charge of developing, well, all of the things that happen behind the scenes. Okay, how are we going to store the data? How are we going to process it? How are we going to make sure that the response times when someone opens the application and clicks to get the list of action movies, for example, is an acceptable response time, for example. So backend developers, if this is something that sparks interest to you, they use different programming languages and different frameworks as well. But some of the popular ones that you're going to find out there are Java, Go, C#, JavaScript, and Rust. And the frameworks and libraries that you're going to find in the market, they really depend on the programming language that you start looking at. So for example, if you want to start developing backend applications using Java, popular choice or the most popular choice nowadays is a framework called the Spring Framework. However, there are other frameworks that are starting to appear. For example, something called Quarkus and something called Micronaut, for example. If you're planning to start looking into Golang as a programming language, then some of the frameworks or libraries that you want to start looking at are, for example, something called Gin. And again, these are just examples to give you a hint of what to start looking for after you finish this video. Now, backend developers also need to be concerned about where are we going to store the data, right? So that's where the data stores or databases start coming into play. So if you're a backend developer, you need to start learning things about database servers, for example, and popular choices in the market are MySQL and PostgreSQL as well. And as a backend developer, you need to start looking into other types of technologies and other types of components for the system that are going to enhance or provide you with some additional support for your servers. Things like caching mechanisms, and you can find something called Memcache. Things like content delivery networks, or CDNs for short. And an example of that is something called CloudFront. And you might need to start looking into cloud providers and start learning about cloud infrastructure. So for example, we have Amazon Web Services, and you also have Google Cloud Platform. And the idea with these cloud providers is that you don't really need to have this big data center inside of your company, the servers are going to be in that cloud infrastructure. And generally, these companies, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft also has its own cloud infrastructure. They provide free tiers for people that are learning and that have very low or very cheap workloads. So you can find a free tier on all of these companies. So if you want to start giving it a try and start learning, again, you can find free tiers and you don't need to start paying any money. Again, as long as you don't overuse it and start creating a lot of servers behind the scenes. Excellent. And this type of role, like the backend developers, are in charge of making sure that the functionality of the system behind the scenes is working as expected. So for example, if you want to pay for a subscription or start a subscription in Netflix, making sure that the payments are coming through correctly, or if you're registering as a new user, where that data is going to be stored. So all of these things are what backend developers are in charge of handling behind the scenes. Now, when we are using an application, and this is a different type of role that is becoming more popular nowadays, there is another set of data that is being sent from your device or from your browser down to the product or the system that you're using. And this is, you can think about it also as a backend system. However, the purpose of that is slightly different. And that's basically what are called analytics. And analytics are mainly in charge of gathering data and tracking data, is called, to understand how users are using that application to enhance the overall experience. So let's talk about, for example, the case of Netflix. Netflix might be interested in learning what trends are happening in a specific country, for example, to be able to show you a list of recommendations. And that's in general a separate team or a separate set of people or developers that are in charge of that type of data, which again is analytics data. And for that part of the system, you're gonna find two different set of engineers or roles that are becoming more and more popular nowadays in the market. One of them are called data engineers, and the other one are called data scientists. Now, data engineers are in charge in general, it depends on the company, of putting in place all of the systems that are going to be able to ingest or receive all of that tracking data. So if you think about Netflix, for example, or Google, they receive a huge volume of data that is meant for analytics purposes. And processing all of that data needs to be done in a timely fashion. And data engineers are in charge of putting all of those systems in place as backend developers would do. However, the difference is that data engineers are more interested in processing the analytic data of the system. And in general, again, depends on the company. They tend to use languages like Java, Scala, or Python, and they need to understand something called SQL. So SQL is a language that allows you to query the data that is stored in the database, for example, MySQL or PostgreSQL. They also use other types of technologies, things like Kafka, Spark, Flink, and Beam are frameworks that you can find, they're open source frameworks from the Apache Foundation, that are going to help these data engineers to be able to ingest and process all of the incoming tracking data. Another popular technology of choice for data engineers is BigQuery from Google that allows you to store big volumes of data as well. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but is something that you can start looking at to learn a bit more about it. Now, data scientists are concerned a little bit in something slightly different, right? Data scientists are more concerned about, okay, once we have the data in, how are we going to understand it, right? So data scientists are the ones that are going to analyze the data behind the scenes and give some meaning to it. Make sure that the business, for example, Netflix or Google, can understand what that data means behind the scenes. So data scientists, again, use a slightly different set of tools than data engineers, but again, there's some overlap between them. Data scientists tend to use programming languages like Python and R. They also need to know SQL in general. And if you're looking into machine learning, there are a couple of frameworks that are becoming a bit more popular nowadays that are called TensorFlow and PyTorch. And if you're planning to analyze data in general or be able to explain to someone what your processing was, you can start looking into something called Jupyter that allows you to have, think about a notebook where you can start putting all of the analysis that you have done for the data and then show it to someone else, for example. And there are companies that provide things like dashboards, and they provide some utilities that allow you to make this data visible to other users as well. One common example that I have seen a lot in some companies is a tool called Looker, which was recently bought by Google. Excellent. So now let's assume that, okay, we have our front-end and back-end developers working together to create the application. We have the data analysts receiving all that tracking data, and we start making changes to that application. Of course, applications and products in the market, they're not static. You don't release a single version of Netflix and that's it. Of course, updates of those applications start being put out into the market. So let's assume, let's say that Netflix decided to change the way that they present the movies out to the users. So how are we going to make sure that that update of the application is working as expected? Well, that's where the QA part of all of this comes into play. And the main role that you're going to find out there in the market are what are called QA analysts. Now, quality assurance analysts, they're in charge of, again, making sure or helping ensure that the application is passing some quality tests and some quality checks before it goes out to the market. The last thing that you want to do is put out something in the market that doesn't work or is broken and that the users are not going to be able to use. And in terms of QA analysts, well, the role varies a lot depending on the company. Some companies are more interested in having QA analysts that are able to automate the tests that are done in a system. In some companies, especially in early stages of a company, QA analysts are more interested or are doing more what is called manual testing, where they basically get a testing version of the application and they do some tests manually to make sure that the application is working correctly. In most companies that I've been with, there is a mix between those two, right? You have QA analysts that are working on some manual testing, and you have some QA analysts that are working in par with the developers of the application to make sure that some of these tests are automated and that they run automatically every time that a change is introduced into the system. Now, in terms of programming languages, QA analysts tend to follow the component being tested. What do I mean by that? If they're testing the backend of a system or of an application and that backend is being developed in Java, in general, although this is not mandatory, the automated tests that are going to be written are going to be also be written in Java. And that's where testing tools start becoming important. For example, if an application is developed in Java, it is very common, although it's not the only framework, to be using JUnit, for example. If you're developing or automating a set of tests for a website, for example, a common tool in the market is what is called Selenium. That allows you to automate some of these things of web testing and make things a little bit easier. Not all of these testing frameworks are perfect in the sense that some of them come with some complications once you start creating a lot of these tests automatically, but they do help in the long run. Excellent. Now let's move a little bit into the management area. And when I'm talking about the management area, it's not necessarily or not only or exclusively talking about management of people, right? Of teams. There are different types of managers inside of technology companies. In this list that I'm showing here, again, not an exhaustive list, I'm showing 4 of the main types of management roles that you're going to find nowadays in technology companies. I'm excluding some of the roles from this list because they tend to vary a lot between different companies. For example, a CTO of a very early startup has a different role or is going to have a different set of responsibilities than a CTO in a very large company. So there is some overlap, of course, between a CTO in a small company versus a large company. However, they tend to vary a lot depending on the size and the scope of what they're doing. However, the types of managers that I'm showing here on the screen tend to be a little bit more consistent across the different companies. Now, the first type of manager that I have here in the list is what are called product managers. Now, product managers are concerned about what are we going to build in the system or for the product. So they're in charge of doing things like, okay, let's speak with the users, and they interact a lot with the other different areas of the company. So for example, they tend to talk a lot about the user experience. So they tend to talk a lot with the user experience designers as well to define that user journey of our application. And they are the ones that define the roadmap about what we want to build in the next couple of months or in the next quarter or in the next year to provide a better experience for our users. Another type of manager are what are called project managers. So one of the main differences between product managers and project managers that is very important to keep in mind is that the product doesn't really have an ending date, right? So if you think about Netflix as a product, it's never ending, or that's the intention of it, right? It's gonna keep evolving throughout the years. Whereas in a project managers, they have a set date. So to deliver specific enhancements for a product, for example, you might set up different projects that maybe, let's talk about again that example of changing the user interface to select the movies in Netflix. That's going to be a specific project, for example, that might have a beginning and an end date. So project managers are more concerned about, okay, how are we going to deliver the changes that we have been discussing with the product managers? And setting the timelines and making sure that progress is keeping the correct pace inside of the company. Now, project managers, of course, also don't work on their own. They need to start working with development teams that are actually the ones doing the changes behind the scenes, making sure that things are on track, and talking with product managers to make sure that, okay, maybe there was a change in priority, how we're going to make sure that those things are taken into account and don't impact or impact as little as possible the different deliverables of the product. Now, the other type of role that I'm putting in here are what are called program managers. Now, program managers have a little bit of a larger scope than a project manager. You can have one program that is composed by multiple projects that need to be delivered for that program to be achieved. So programs can have a set of multiple projects inside of a company that are intended to solve a particular problem or target a specific goal for the company. So program managers are a little bit more high level in the sense that they take charge of multiple projects and they need to start talking about different projects at the same time, making sure that things are on track, keeping visibility to higher management about what's going on behind the scenes. And the responsibility, again, is a little bit broader in the sense that they're not focusing on a particular project. Now, the last type of manager that I have in this list is what are called engineering managers. Now, engineering managers, on the other hand, are people managers as such. So engineering managers are mainly in charge, of course, of different engineering teams. Usually an engineering manager inside of a company is leading a team of usually 5 to 6 developers, although it depends on a lot on the company that you're working for. And they're in charge of things like career progression. Okay, how are the different developers inside of the team working towards their next promotion, for example? What skills or what kind of things are they missing to make sure that they're making progress in their career as well? Engineering managers, depending on the company, are also concerned with making sure that the deliverables of the team are being hit, that they're being delivered. So engineering managers tend to be working very closely with project managers and product managers as well. Now, of course, they're engineering managers, so there's an engineering component to them. They tend to be people that come from maybe a development background in general, and they can also provide support to the team when an engineering decision needs to be made. Maybe the developers of the team that they're leading are stuck by a specific technical decision, so they should also be able to provide some input. So engineering managers tend to be, of course, more senior developers or more senior engineers that have seen different types of problems in the industry before, and they can provide some input to the teams that they're managing. Now, one of the things that you're going to find in different companies is that these 4 types of roles, product, project, program, and engineering managers, you're going to find some of them in some companies and you might not find some of them in others. And usually it depends on how the company is structured, but also it depends on the stage that that company is in. So for example, a very early stage startup company might not have all of these roles defined. And this applies also to some of the roles that we have seen in previous parts of this video. So depending on the size of the company or what you're focusing on, some of these roles might be done by multiple people, or sorry, some of these roles might be done by a single person. For example, a person can be an engineering manager and a project manager for a specific team. And in some cases, well, maybe the company doesn't have yet QA analysts. So the QA responsibility is entirely held usually by the developers of that company. Excellent. Now let's move on and talk about what is called production operations management and automation. And what do we mean by that? So again, let's talk about that example of Netflix trying to change the look and feel of the catalog of movies that they're going to present to us. Let's assume that they want to try a different way of showing that list of movies or that list of content to the users. So, of course, that's going to go through different stages. The product managers need to speak with the UX designers and the UI designers about how that's going to look. The front-end developers need to do all of the changes in the code to make sure that it's looking as expected. And they need to be working very closely with the backend developers to ensure that if there are any changes that are required to get the list of movies or the list of content to the user, that those things are happening properly. So let's assume that all of these things have been done and that the QA analysts have said, yeah, this looks okay, we can actually go and ship it to production and put that in front of the users. So the question is, okay, once you have those changes and the new software ready to put it into the user's hands, how is that going to happen? And this is where different types of roles start coming into play. There is something called an SRE, or a site reliability engineer. There are also engineers called DevOps engineers, and there are also build engineers. They're slightly different, but they share some commonalities as well. So let's start talking about SREs and DevOps, for example, engineers. One of their tasks, or one of the things that they help development teams achieve, is exactly that, what I was mentioning. Okay, how are we going to put that new application in front of the users, right? Usually the code that is developed needs to be packaged somehow and be put into the application servers that maybe the backend developers are interacting with, for example. So the question is, how do we go from the code that is being developed to an application that can actually run in the servers and run in a website, for example, in a web browser, for example, or run in a mobile device? There is a set of steps and a set of things that need to happen from one place to the other. And that's where SREs, DevOps, and build engineers come into play. Another thing that, or another part of the equation that the SREs and the DevOps engineers actually put into place as well is, let's assume that, okay, we put the application now in front of the users. How do we monitor that and how do we make sure that it's actually working as we expected? And SRE and DevOps engineers actually do help the different development teams to ensure that things are being monitored and that things are working as expected. What do I mean by that? One of the things that the development teams, for example, an SRE can help monitor is the error rate of an application. So let's assume that a user starts Netflix and they're going to be shown the new way of seeing the list of movies, for example, right? What happens if that fails? Well, that's going to generate an error somewhere. If we can capture that error and tell our systems that an error is occurring, and we see that that error rate is going up very quickly, and maybe we can start detecting that something wrong is happening. And that's where monitoring starts becoming very important. If we don't see that information, if we don't know if things are actually working or not working for the users, it's going to be very difficult, or it's going to be a little bit late in the day to start taking some actions to correct those errors. So one common action that we might need to do if something goes wrong is to roll back the changes, put back the previous version until we find out what is happening behind the scenes. In any case, so SRE and DevOps engineers are hugely important, build engineers as well, depending on this type of system that you're building. And again, they use a slightly different set of tools. So SRE and DevOps engineers generally tend to use Golang, Python, and Bash scripts to achieve some of the tasks that they need to perform. as an SRE and a DevOps engineer, it might be very relevant to you to start learning about what are called continuous integration and continuous deployment tools like Jenkins and Circle CI. These are tools that every time that a change is made in the code of a system, they're going to test it, for example. And if all of the tests are okay, you might want to deploy them automatically somewhere. You might also need to start learning about monitoring tools. For example, a very popular tool nowadays is called Prometheus. And they need to be very familiar nowadays with cloud infrastructure providers, for example, Google Cloud Platform or Amazon Web Services. And something that is becoming very, very popular nowadays in the market is something called Kubernetes, but I'm not going to go into a lot of details for that in this video. And again, as with some of the roles that I've talked about in the past, depending on the company, you might not find these roles straight away. So some of the responsibilities, for example, for SRE and DevOps inside of a company at an early stage, usually fall in the hands of a backend developer, for example. And once a company starts growing, you're going to start finding these roles appearing inside of a company. The SRE and DevOps roles are becoming more and more relevant nowadays. And if this is of interest to you, you might want to start looking, for example, into the SRE book that has been published by Google, and it's of free access. Excellent. So far we've covered a lot of ground, and I know that this has been a very quick introduction to some of these types of roles. And we haven't really been talking about yet development teams. So all of these roles that I have been introducing, they don't work on their own, right? So you don't have a single front-end developer working on something and a backend developer working on something else. Usually inside of companies, of course, you're going to find work development teams. And the way these teams are organized, it depends a lot on the company that you're going to be working for. Some common types of alignments are the ones that I'm going to be talking about here, are vertically aligned, horizontally aligned, and hybrid. Now, what do I mean by vertically or horizontally aligned? In a company where you have horizontally aligned development teams, it means that usually the same discipline or the same type of role can form a development team. Let me explain. If you have a company that has 5 backend developers, in a horizontally aligned company, you're going to have a backend development team where the 5 backend developers are going to be sitting together and solving everything that is backend related inside of that company. And the same goes for the front-end developers. If you have, let's say, 10 front-end developers and your company is horizontally aligned, they're going to be their own separate team. You're going to have a team of front-end developers that are going to be working on everything that is front-end related. And in these kind of companies, of course, the front-end team needs to start talking with the back-end team to basically achieve a particular product requirement or be able to provide a specific user experience. Now, another common type of alignment of teams is what are called vertically aligned. Now, when we talk about vertically alignment, or vertical alignment, sorry, we're talking about, in general, about product alignments. So let me give you an example. Let's assume that inside of Netflix, you're going to have a team that is specifically concerned about how users are consuming the movies of Netflix, right? So their whole purpose is making sure that when a user gets into the Netflix system or they open the Netflix website, the user experience between the user loading the application and actually starting to see a movie. So, for example, displaying the list of movies and actually making sure that the movie starts playing for them. And that particular team is not going to be in charge of user registration or subscriptions or payments. They're not interested in any of that. So you can say in this case that that team is vertically aligned to that movie consumer experience, right? And that's what we call a vertically aligned team. And vertically aligned teams, they tend to have a mix of roles to make sure that they can deliver the code and the changes necessary to cover that experience or that part of the product that they've been charged with. And just to give you a quick example here, let's assume that for that movie consumer experience team, we're going to have the following setup of a team. We're going to have a product manager, we're going to have an engineering manager, maybe 3 front-end developers, 1 mobile developer to do the changes on the mobile apps, and maybe 2 backend developers. Again, this is just a quick example to show that in this case, you're going to have a cross-functional team working to deliver a specific experience to the user. Just to provide another example about vertically aligned teams, let's think about, for example, Amazon or an e-commerce website in general. You could have a vertically aligned team that is just in charge of the experience of the users browsing the catalog and searching for products. And then you can have a different team that is going to be in charge of the part of the system that is actually going to be concerned with the payments, right? Like showing the shopping cart, getting the payments from the users. And then you might have a separate team that is in charge of the shipping experience, making sure that the users can track their orders and seeing where the product is at any point in time. Now, I'm also talking about here hybrid alignments, right? So in some companies, you're going to find a mixture of these two types of alignments. So if you take a look at the example of the vertically aligned team that I'm showing here, which is the movie consumer experience team that we talked about, you're going to see that at the moment, that team doesn't really have any QA analysts in there at the moment. And they don't have any SRE or DevOps people in there that can help them with the deployments of the application. So in some companies, some of these teams are going to be shared across the whole organization. So for example, maybe you're going to have a data science team or analytics team that is going to help with the analytics of the whole company. Or maybe you have a team of QA analysts that make sure that the product as a whole is working as expected. So in those cases, you're going to find this kind of hybrid alignment or hybrid structure of the teams. And that's perfectly normal. And it depends on the company what works best. And usually it's a little bit of a trial and error before different companies find that perfect or that better working team structure that allows them to move at a better speed. In any case, the point that I'm trying to make here is, of course, that the different roles that we have been talking about so far, they don't work in a vacuum, right? They work as part of different development teams. And usually, depending on the size of the company, you're not going to have a single development team. You're going to have multiple development teams that are providing different parts of the product or different parts of the system. Excellent. Now, let's talk a little bit about, okay, I know that if you're watching this video, maybe you're new to all of this, and you're asking yourself, okay, where can I start? What can I start learning to make sure that I go or that I can start going to a job interview and land that first job that might be of interest to you. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, the idea of this was to give you a little bit of a taste or a little bit of an introduction to the different types of roles and what kind of things do they do inside of a tech company. So if any of these roles is of interest to you and you say, hey, actually, yeah, game development is something that interests me, or actually build automation might be something that I want to learn a little bit more about, then one of the first things that I would encourage you to do is to go and read a little bit more about these roles, right? Again, this was a very quick introduction. It's a 60-minute video where I'm trying to talk about a lot of different roles. So I'm not going into a lot of detail here. So one of the things is, if any of these actually sparked any interest, try to go out online and type the name of the role and see what they do in a little bit more detail, and learn more about the specific roles that may be of interest to you. Now, if you're going to a technical role, for example, if you're going to go into a development role or into an SRE role, then make sure that you know a programming language, right? It could be any programming language, but make sure that you know at least one of them. And that's going to be very critical to start a career as a developer or as a technical person in a tech company. One big note that I want to make here is when you're going to start learning your first programming language, you might find what is called the contempt culture in programming. And what do I mean by contempt culture? I'm going to put a link to a very good blog post that was written by a person called Aurin Shaw. Apologies if I'm misreading or mispronouncing the name. And it talks in a lot of detail about what I'm talking about here of contempt culture. But it's usually, in summary, it's usually this. If you're going to start learning, let's say, language X, maybe Python or Java or whatever it is, you might find inside of that community maybe people talking about poorly or negatively about other programming languages and vice versa. And that doesn't really help a lot when you're trying to decide what language to learn. Everyone in their own communities might say that language X is the best and language Y might be very bad. But the reality is that different languages were developed for different reasons and they target different markets and they're constantly evolving, right? The point that I'm trying to drive here is don't get involved or don't get into this contempt culture when you're learning your first programming language or even later in your career because it doesn't help anyone. Just make sure, or one of the best advices that I can give you is, okay, if you're gonna go to a backend development role and you know that you're gonna be or that you want to go for a specific company, if you know that that company that you're interested in is using Golang or JavaScript as a programming language, maybe that's the language that you want to start learning. Another good piece of advice is that if you have already tried starting learning different programming languages, maybe you have developed already your own feeling about what programming language you like the most and what you find easier versus another programming language. And maybe you have developed your own preference, right? And that's perfectly fine. And if you already have found that, then stick to that language whilst you're learning your first programming language, right? And the next advice is, of course, to practice, right? Try to practice different things inside using that programming language or that tool that you want to learn and try to find out different ways of doing things. So, for example, if you're learning a programming language, you can find different challenges online about certain things to do. For example, if you're trying to learn backend development, a common challenge that people try to do as a personal project is let's try to develop a web application server, right? And see what happens when you need to do that from scratch. So the idea, of course, in those challenges is not to use any framework, is try to do it by hand using the programming language that you chose. The last advice that I can give you is try to find a mentor if possible. And when I'm talking about a mentor, I don't mean like, okay, it has to be a professional mentor that actually is charging you for their services. If you can afford that and you can do that, then by all means, that's going to be very valuable to you to find someone that can guide you. But when you're starting, a mentor can be a friend that is already in the industry. In my experience, people are more than willing to share their experience and how they're finding particular things. And they can give you advice about what technical libraries or what programming languages to look into in a lot more detail than what I can provide in this 60-minute video. Now, a couple of set of final advices or final things that I can tell you about is once you have all this experience and you're ready to go into your job interview, try to practice job interviews beforehand. There are a lot of places where you can find mock interviews and they provide you with a lot of insight and a lot of feedback that is going to be very valuable to you to make sure that you perform well in those job interviews. And do remember as well that in terms of interviews, you're going to find different types of interviews, specifically depending on the role that you're going to apply for. But if you're going to go into the development role, for example, it's good if you practice different types of interviews as well, right? So if you plan to go into or planning to apply to a big technology company, one of the common types of interviews that you're going to be faced with are what are called problem-solving interviews. And it's very good to start looking into websites that help you practice for these interviews. And they are going to provide you with a lot of different problems that you can start solving and getting more experience with because that's going to help you during your interview process. In any case, we're reaching the 60-minute mark. Again, this was a very long video. The main thing is I hope you found this useful. We're covering a lot of different types of roles. Again, this is a very high level view of all of these roles. But the idea here was to provide you with some information about what can you expect to find inside of different tech companies. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. We haven't talked here about how you progress in the different roles. In most cases, you're going to start possibly as a junior developer, for example. And the same goes for the different types of roles. You're going to find junior product managers. You're going to find junior data engineers, for example. And as you grow inside of the company, you're going to start, of course, going up your career ladder. So if you start as a junior developer, usually inside of a company, you go to a mid-level, then to a senior, and then you start deciding where do you want to go. Do you want to keep on the technical path? Maybe you are not interested in people management, or maybe you want to start leading teams and going into people management a little bit more. And that's where you're going to start deciding, okay, do I want to start becoming a tech lead inside of a development team, or maybe move into engineering management as well. Another thing that I want to highlight here is that, for example, for product manager roles, something that I've seen very often is that people start in a different role inside of a company. Maybe they start as a front-end developer and they start getting a taste for product management. And inside of the same company that they're working for, they start making the shift from one role to the other. I've also seen front-end developers in different companies that maybe they started getting an interest into data engineering or data science, and they make the shift inside of the same company from one tech role to the other. So it's not like if you choose to be a front-end developer, you need to do that for the rest of your life. That's not the point at all. The important thing is that in different companies, you can start doing those transitions if you want to change the type of role that you're doing. In any case, we hope you found this useful. Thank you for joining us. Again, it's a very long video, but we hope you find something useful out of this. And we wish you all the best in your tech career. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time.